Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, and we're talking about the appointment of Robert Mueller to be special counsel to investigate the Russian collusion allegations directed towards the President of the United States as well as the administration, the Comey termination and what was said or not said between the two gentlemen in their various conversations and meetings. And Mark Stein, we just discussed what famed Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, a Hillary Clinton supporter, had to say on the topic. There's no discernible crime. There's no statute pointed to. There should have been no special counsel appointed. Those were Dershowitz's conclusions, that this is a lot of political reputation management by people who are charged with upholding the rule of law in a free society.
So it is a witch hunt?
Commentary.
Yeah, so it is a witch hunt like President Trump says
it's political. I mean, you call it a witch hunt or not, but it's political. It's not with respect to the rule of law, which is the point. And also, as Mark Stein points out in his inimitable fashion, there seems to be a little role confusion with the branches of government, specifically the judiciary and the legislature. He made this point on Stuart Varney's show.
I am, actually, and I think if it's a choice between Trump and the congressional GOP, I think the congressional GOP is sending a very dangerous message here. They're basically telling their voters elections don't matter, and that no matter what you vote for, nothing changes. And I mean, just to be serious about this, Stuart, I think we have a dysfunctional system. We have a judicial branch that legislates and a legislative branch that spends more time on pseudo-court hearings. That's to say, we have district court judges who presume to make immigration policy, and Congress, meanwhile, can't legislate anything. But if the under-assistant deputy under-assistant director of the FBI hears that Trump once changed planes in Vladivostok, then Congress turns on a dime and can schedule 3 days of hearings with the guy. They're not doing what they're meant to be doing.
For more, Mark Stein is Mark Stein. For more on this topic and the legal matters at bar, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend and former United States Attorney General under President George W. Bush, and now the Dean of the Belmont University School of Law in Nashville, Tennessee. He is Alberto Gonzales. General Gonzales, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Good morning.
So give us your take on the appointment of the special counsel first and foremost. Is it appropriate in this case, or was it unnecessary backside covering by Rod Rosenstein and the Trump administration?
I think that look, I know the FBI, and I have a great deal of confidence in the agents there, and I think that they are certainly quite capable of completing this investigation, and I think they were probably more motivated than ever after Jim Comey was fired to get to the bottom of what happened here, if anything, quite frankly. But I think given the fact that the manner in which Jim Comey was fired and all the swirl about him feeling uncomfortable and all this kind of stuff, and certain comments made by President Trump, however you want to interpret them, it probably was inevitable that you'd have a special counsel appointed, quite frankly, and it's certainly consistent with the statute, which says that if there is a feeling that there's either a conflict of interest or extraordinary circumstances, and if it would be in the best interest of justice, then a special counsel would be appropriate. So it's hard to argue that the statute wasn't met. Obviously, these are always judgment calls by either the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General, and frankly, I think given all the politics, how this has become so political, it probably was inevitable, quite frankly.
But what do you think is the real reason why President Trump fired James Comey? Because he's changed his story about 3 times now.
Well, I think that's one of the things that's really hurt the president. First of all, I was unhappy with the way it was done in terms of Jim Comey finding out about it on television. I think it was unprofessional and unfair to anybody, quite frankly, to learn of the filing in that fashion. And I think the back and forth in terms of the reasons why, I think further confused the narrative. And as I said publicly immediately after the firing, if Jim Comey was fired in order to stop an investigation into wrongdoing that Donald Trump knew about, that would be definitely wrong. If Donald Trump fired Jim Comey because of the actions and statements he's made over the past 8 or 9 months, I can't argue with that. I think Rod Rosenstein laid it all out. I think there are obviously a number of former senior DOJ officials referenced in the Rosenstein memo, which clearly indicates almost universal condemnation about Jim Comey's performance, but by both Democrats and Republicans, and by former senior DOJ officials appointed by Republican and Democratic presidents. So it's, I think I think there was a sufficient basis, and I stand behind Rod Rosenstein's memo.
Yeah, Andy McCarthy makes the point that it's much harder to establish an obstruction of justice offense against a president who orders an investigation to be dropped, and nobody's suggesting that President Trump did exactly, and tried to influence as far as we've gotten, than against one who ostensibly permits an investigation to proceed but insidiously manipulates it the way, for example, that Nixon attempted to do. Does McCarthy have a point there in terms of just trying to make sense of this and trying to get to some point where either evidence is presented in some form or fashion, or there is established the alleged offense that's being investigated?
Yeah, that's the thing about it. I think that no matter how this thing has proceeded and various other ways it could have proceeded, we're going to find out what happened. I think either the FBI, the special counsel, Congress, the American media, there are so many groups, organizations looking at what might possibly have happened here, that we're going to find out what happened. I think one of the lessons that I came away from my service is that with respect to decisions that are controversial or arguably, outside the legal bounds, you just can't hide that. It's going to come out. People are going to talk about it. And speaking of leaking, I am really dismayed about the level of leaking coming out of the White House. If you're a career person, that is one thing. But if you owe your job to this president, and if you disagree with what's going on, you should resign. Then you can say anything you want to. But to leak information that's damaging the president, in my judgment, is disloyal. And obviously the number one priority is the Constitution and protecting our country. But again, if you feel that strongly about it, you shouldn't be leaking information from my perspective. You should resign, and then you can say whatever you want to. So that to me has been very disappointing, and I know it's been distressing to the senior officials in the White House and, of course, to President Trump.
Well, and Jason Chaffetz said whoever leaked the contents of the conversation between the president and the Russians should be prosecuted, just as Republicans have said, although this story's been completely buried. The one thing that we know is true is that the leaking of Michael Flynn's name was illegal, and the person responsible for that should be prosecuted. And so perhaps the good news, maybe inadvertent good news, is with a special counsel, Robert Mueller, he is basically boundary free. And so he can go a lot of different directions. And then there's still these open questions about actual illegalities, the leaking of information that is classified, which is a violation of the law. And that is something that Mueller could potentially investigate and find the culprits.
That's true. The mandate that's been given to him by Rod Rosenstein is very broad. Now, that's not to say that an investigation under Jim Comey wouldn't have ended in the same result. But clearly, Bob Mueller in the mandate given to him by Rod Rosenstein would have the authority, the power to investigate those kinds of matters.
So going back to this conversation between President Trump and Comey that took place on February 14th, where he asked him allegedly, to end the FBI probe into General Flynn. If that really did happen, why wouldn't Comey at the time come forward and claim there's, intimidation of the witness or obstruction of justice?
Well, this is another thing that really, really troubles me. Some people have said, well, he felt he could handle it. We have protocols in place. The FBI director is not autonomous. He reports up to the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General. Those two individuals, one of their responsibilities is to protect agencies like the FBI. And so as soon as Jim Comey had that conversation, any inkling at all of any kind of pressure or persuasion by the White House, he should have immediately talked to the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General, and it would have been their job to then push back at the White House. And maybe he had that conversation, and Sessions and Bente or Rob Rosenstein didn't do anything about it. Well, that would be a failure on their part. But if Jim did not convey to the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General or the acting Attorney General at the time of this pressure, then he failed in his job. He failed to protect the FBI. And again, I've heard stories that, he felt that was his obligation, was to protect the FBI. Well, he got himself fired. And now, he's certainly not protecting the FBI today. I think that's another example of sometimes Jim's, I don't want to say arrogance, but hubris, thinking that I can handle this. It doesn't matter whether you think you can handle it. You have an obligation to go to your superiors and convey to them you're feeling this pressure. I can't imagine any attorney general who would be satisfied with a situation where his FBI director or her FBI director is feeling White House pressure and is not being told about it.
Well, and in addition to that, we have this month, both Comey and his number two, now the acting director, testifying before Congress that no one has tried to interfere or impede the FBI's investigation into Russian collusion. So now he's going to potentially appear before the Senate and recast that as somebody did after he testified on May 3rd that nobody did?
Well, I can't predict how Jim's going to testify. I'm assuming he's going to talk about conversations he had with the president. I don't know. I'm assuming he'll be asked questions, or at least he should be asked questions about, well, why didn't you do something about it? And I guess the only thing he can say is, I felt I could handle it. And but again, even if you feel like you can handle it, that's not the right response. The appropriate response would have been to notify your superiors and let them handle it. That's their job. You've got a job to do, which is to move forward with the investigation.
Let me get one more constitutional matter before you, General Gonzales, and that is some of these incredible op-eds. And this one comes from one of my favorite editorialists normally, Ross Douthat, over at New York Times. But the idea of a 25th Amendment action against President Trump, calling on Vice President Pence and cabinet officials to invoke Section 4 of the 25th Amendment to essentially submit a written declaration to the President pro temp of the Senate and the Speaker of the House that the President is incapacitated to do his job, declare him unable to discharge the powers and duties, and to go back and forth to try and remove Trump from office at this point. It's one of the most, just my estimation, I just got a JD, I'm not a former Attorney General, but this is absurdly unconstitutional, and it's striking to me that a serious, thoughtful person like Douthat would make such an argument, and others, of course, following suit. What's your reaction to that contention?
Well, I hadn't heard about that, but I would declare it as sort of it's a mutiny. It's ridiculous. The framers, that provision is put in place for those situations where I think the president is mentally incapacitated and cannot perform the job. And so the notion, if that were allowed to happen, we really would become no different than many other countries around the world where you have coups taking place because people want to assume power. So that to me is surprising, and I think that should be rejected out of hand.
All right. He is former United States Attorney General, now the Dean of the Belmont University School of Law, Alberto Gonzales. Thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.